Malcolm Vexley grabbed the roses off the passenger seat and laughed. Actually laughed low, satisfied, the laugh of a man who has never once paid for anything he has done. He had just spent the night tangled in silk sheets with Isabella Dubois in a 5-star suite his wife's money helped pay for. Now he was driving home to that same wife, 7 months pregnant, waiting, trusting, with flowers in one hand and a lie sharpened like a knife in the other. He had used that knife before, many times, and Evelina had always bled quietly without making a scene. This morning he was certain would be no different. He was wrong in ways he could not yet imagine. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens inside that mansion in the next few minutes will change everything. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The roses were a nice touch. Malcolm always thought so. There was a particular kind of art to coming home after a night like that, the right posture, the right expression, the right degree of tired but loving that made Evelina feel guilty for even thinking about being upset. He had spent years perfecting it, the slight slump in the shoulders that suggested exhaustion from working too hard, the way he would set the flowers down first before kissing her forehead so she would smell the sweetness before she looked too carefully at his eyes. The voice, low, warm, just the right amount of apologetic without actually apologizing for anything real. It was a performance, and Malcolm Vexley had never once received a bad review. He pulled through the iron gates of their estate in Greenwich just after 10 in the morning, the autumn light cutting sharp and gold across the manicured lawn. The Vexley estate was the kind of place that announced wealth before you even touched the front door. 3 stories of pale limestone old ivy creeping along the eastern wing, a fountain in the circular driveway that had been imported from Italy piece by piece. Malcolm barely noticed it anymore. When you grew up with money, you stopped seeing the money. It just became background. He grabbed the roses, checked his phone one last time, one last message from Isabella, a string of heart emojis he deleted without responding to, and stepped out of the car. The front door opened before he reached it. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Normally the housekeeper, Mrs. Patel, would open the door, or Evelina would be upstairs, and he would have to make his way through the house and find her, which gave him the advantage of choosing the ground, the timing, the framing of the moment. But today the door opened on its own, and for just a half second, Malcolm Vexley stood on the front step with a dozen roses in his hand and felt, for reasons he could not immediately name, completely exposed. He stepped inside. The house was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of an early morning, not the soft quiet of a woman reading in the other room. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that had edges, the kind that leaned forward. "Evelina?" His voice came out lighter than he intended. No answer. He walked through this foyer, past the formal sitting room, past the staircase where her portrait hung from their wedding. She had been 26 in that photograph, wearing ivory silk, smiling the way people smile when they still believe the future holds nothing but good things. He turned toward the conservatory, and there she was. Evelina Renford Vexley stood at the far end of the room, with her back to the glass wall, the autumn garden blurring soft and golden behind her. She was wearing a deep charcoal dress, not casual, not the kind of thing she wore around the house. She was dressed like she was going somewhere, or like she had already arrived somewhere important. Her dark hair was pinned back, her hands were folded in front of her over the curve of her belly, 7 months full now, and she did not move when he entered the room. She did not smile, she did not say his name, she just looked at him. And in that single look, calm, clear, and absolutely without mercy, Malcolm felt the first real crack of something that might have been fear. "Hey." He lifted the roses slightly. "I'm sorry I was out so late. The Bridgewater meeting ran long, and then the traffic on—" "Put the flowers down, Malcolm." Her voice was quiet, not cold exactly, precise like a scalpel. He lowered the roses slowly onto the wicker table near the door. "Evie, I know you're upset, and I understand that. I should have called earlier. I said put them down. I didn't say start talking." He stopped. In 14 years of marriage, Evelina Renford Vexley had never spoken to him in that tone. She had cried. She had pleaded. She had gone quiet for days at a time in that particular wounded way that made him feel like a monster, and then eventually made him feel nothing at all. But she had never not once looked at him the way she was looking at him right now. like she had already finished the fight he hadn't started yet. "Okay," he said carefully. He crossed the room slowly, the way you move around an animal you're not sure about. "Okay, I can hear that you're angry, and I'm not angry, Malcolm." He stopped again. "I was angry," she continued. "6 months ago, I was angry. 8 months ago, when I found the hotel receipt in your jacket, I was angry. A year ago, when I saw the message on your second phone, the one you keep in your car, I was angry." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm not angry anymore." The room felt smaller suddenly. "What are you saying?" She turned to the low table beside her, a glass-topped thing she used for her morning tea, and picked up a manila envelope. It was thick, sealed, formal-looking. She held it at her side with the ease of someone who had been holding it for a long time. "I'm saying I've had time to move past anger," she said, "and do something more useful with my energy. Evie." His voice changed, still controlled, but the warmth had gone out of it. The performance was failing, and he knew it. "What is that? Come find out." She held the envelope out. He crossed the room, took it, turned it over in his hands. His name was on the front, Malcolm James Vexley, printed in clean professional type. No return address, no law firm name on the outside. He looked up at her. "Open it," she said. He did. The first sheet was a cover letter from a firm he didn't recognize, Hargrove, Elias & Cole. Legal representation for one, Evelina Christine Renford Vexley. The language was formal and dense, and his eyes moved through it quickly, looking for the part that would tell him how bad this actually was. He found it on the second line of the second paragraph. "Petition for dissolution of marriage. He stopped, looked up. "You're filing for divorce." "I have filed," she corrected him gently. "Past tense. It was submitted to the court 3 days ago." 3 days. He pulled the pages apart, scanning. "Evie, you can't. You're 7 months pregnant. You're not thinking clearly. Whatever you think you know, we can talk about it. We can go to someone, we can—" "Keep reading," she said. "I don't need to keep reading. I need you to hear me. Malcolm, still calm, still precise. Keep reading." He looked back down at the papers. The next section was not about the divorce. It was a 17-page financial disclosure. Transactions, account numbers, transfer records, dates and amounts going back nearly 6 years, and next to each entry, a single identifying note. Vexley Industries operating account to offshore holding, Grand Cayman $2.4 million. Secondary transfer to private LLC registered in Delaware, $870,000. Corporate acquisition fund irregularly accessed $1.1 million. He turned a page. Payment to Isabella Dubois. Personal account, $5 million. The room went very still. He read that line 3 times. Then he looked up slowly, and for the first time in a very long time, Malcolm Vexley had nothing to say. $5 million, Evelina said. Her voice was perfectly even. "You told me the Bridgewater deal collapsed because of market volatility. You told the board the same thing. But the money from that deal didn't go into operating reserves, Malcolm. It went into an LLC you created 18 months ago, and from there it moved into a private account controlled by your mistress." "That's not—" His voice came out dry and strange. "That's a mischaracterization of— I have the wire transfer confirmations. I have the account registration documents. I have the name of the compliance officer at your bank who flagged the transaction and was subsequently transferred to a different department." She paused. "I also have his sworn statement." Malcolm set the papers down on the table. He needed a second. He needed to think. He needed to breathe, to recalibrate, to figure out what she actually had versus what she thought she had, to find the gaps. "How long?" he asked. "Have I known, or have I been building the case? Either." "I've known about Isabella for almost 2 years," she said. "I started building the case 14 months ago." A pause. "I hired someone very good, someone who doesn't ask questions about why, only about what and how much." "A private investigator." "A private intelligence contractor," she corrected. "There's a difference. Private investigators take photographs of people outside hotels. What I hired is a firm that traces money." She looked at him steadily. "It turns out, Malcolm, that when you move money the way you've been moving it, you leave fingerprints everywhere. You just have to know where to look." He pressed his fingers to his mouth, stared at the table. ran the numbers in his head, tried to figure out how much she actually had documented versus how much she was implying, because that was the game, wasn't it? Always figure out the hand you're actually playing against. Evie. He looked up and changed. His voice softened. It made it raw, reached for something that sounded like genuine grief. I know I've hurt you. I know that. And you have every right to be furious with me. But whatever you think those documents show, there is an explanation, and if you would just give me a few days— I gave you 14 years, she said. I'm not giving you another few days. We have a child coming. I know. For the first time, something shifted very slightly in her expression, not weakness, more like the acknowledgement of weight. That is why I am doing this precisely now, not despite the baby, because of him. Him. It's a boy, he said. She didn't answer. She just looked at him. Evie, my lawyer will be in contact with yours by end of business today, she said. The terms in that envelope are the terms I expect to reach an agreement on. You'll find they're fair, specific, and non-negotiable. She uncrossed her arms and moved toward the doorway. The guest suite on the east wing has been prepared. I would ask that you stay there until you've made arrangements to stay elsewhere. You're asking me to leave my own house. I'm asking you to stay in one wing of it for a few days, she said. That's not the same thing. And legally, as of 3 days ago, the estate is subject to a status quo order, which means neither of us can make unilateral changes to our shared holdings. She paused in the doorway. I assume your lawyer will explain the rest? She left. He stood alone in the conservatory for a long moment. The papers fanned out on the table beside him, the roses drooping slightly in their cellophane wrap. The house hummed with that strange silence again, not peaceful, not comfortable, but alive with something. He could almost hear it breathing. He pulled out his phone and called the one person he called when something went wrong, had called since he was 17, and got caught cheating on an exam at Dalton, and needed someone to make it disappear. His father answered on the second ring. Dad, we have a problem. Alistair Vexley's voice was flat and alert, in the way that old money always is, never surprised, never panicked, just immediately orienting toward control. What kind? Evelina. Malcolm moved toward the window, lowering his voice out of habit, even though she was gone. She's filed. And she has Dad, she has documentation, financial, corporate transfers, the Bridgewater Fund. A pause. How much? I don't know the full extent yet, but she's named the Cayman accounts. She has bank records. She has a witness statement from someone in compliance. Another pause. Longer. Where did she get it? She hired someone. An intelligence firm, she said, 14 months ago. The silence stretched out like a fault line. Son. Alistair's voice had changed. Gone flat in a different way, not oriented, just cold. Listen to me very carefully. Do not speak to her again without counsel present. Do not respond to anything in writing, and come to the office now. Dad. Now Malcolm. He hung up. Malcolm stood there another moment, looked at the envelope, looked at the roses, looked at the portrait in the hallway through the open conservatory door, his wife at 26, smiling in ivory silk, believing in a future that had never arrived. Then he picked up his keys and walked back out the way he had come in. The fountain was still running in the driveway. The iron gates opened automatically. The roses sat on the wicker table in the conservatory, already beginning to wilt. Inside, from the second floor, Evelina watched his car disappear down the drive. She stood at the window with one hand resting on the curve of her belly and the other wrapped around a phone, a text already composed and waiting. She pressed send. Across town, in a small office that had no name on the door and no listing on any directory, a woman named Dara Cole received the message, read it once, and picked up her own phone. He's going to his father, she said to the person on the other end. Like we thought. Start the clock. She hung up, looked out her own window at the New York skyline. Phase 2, she said quietly to the room, and went back to work. Okay. Malcolm Vexley had always believed that the worst thing that could happen in a room was losing control of the conversation. He had spent his adult life in boardrooms and contract negotiations and family dinners that were really power struggles in formal wear, and in every one of those rooms, he had the same edge. He knew things other people didn't know, and he never let them know what he knew. But sitting in the back of his car, being driven toward Midtown and his father's office, he turned the pages of that envelope again and again, and the thing that gnawed at him, the thing that was starting to crack open, something cold in his chest, was not what was in those pages. It was what wasn't. Evelina had shown him the transfers, the offshore accounts, the LLC, the Isabella payment, but she hadn't shown him the emails. He had sent emails. Stupid, careless, late-night emails to intermediaries to the Delaware attorney who set up the LLC to a former board member who knew about the acquisition and had been paid to look the other way. He had been careful, he thought. Encrypted servers separate devices. But if she had the bank records, if she had a compliance officer's sworn statement, did she have the emails? He didn't know, and not knowing was the worst position he had ever been in. His driver, quiet professional, the kind of man Malcolm had never once asked the name of, despite 3 years of daily proximity, said nothing in the front seat. Malcolm's phone buzzed. Isabella. He stared at her name. Then he sent it to voicemail. A minute later, a text. I need to talk to you. She called me Malcolm. Your wife called me. He felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. He dialed. She picked up on the first ring, and he could hear immediately that she was scared. Not the performative upset she sometimes used when she wanted his attention, but genuinely frightened, her voice higher than usual, the syllables falling over each other. She called me this morning, Isabella said. An hour ago. She knew my number. She knew Malcolm. She knew my address. She knew the name of my mother. She said, what did she say? She said, a pause, a sharp breath. She said she wasn't calling to threaten me. She said she was calling to let me know that my name is in certain documents, and that when those documents become public record, which she said was a matter of when not, if it would be better for me if I had already retained legal counsel. Malcolm closed his eyes. She told you to get a lawyer. She told me the name of a lawyer, a specific person. She said this person had experience protecting people in situations like mine. Isabella's voice broke slightly. Malcolm, what is happening? What is she doing? What are these documents? What does she mean? The $5 million is going to be public record. How does she know about— Stop! He kept his own voice level, though his hand was tight on the phone. Don't say anything else on this line. Do you understand me? Don't say the number. Don't say any specific figures. And do not contact anyone, not the bank, not the attorney, no one until I call you again. Malcolm. Isabella. Firm now. Back in control or performing it, which was close enough. Do you trust me? A pause, shorter than it should have been. Yes, she said. Then wait for my call. He hung up. Evelina had called Isabella, not to scream at her, not to threaten her, not to make herself feel better in that scorned wife way that lawyers warned their clients against. She had called her to be helpful, professionally, strategically helpful. She had given her the name of a lawyer, probably a lawyer Evelina's own team had already contacted, which meant she had possibly already secured their cooperation, or at least ensured their neutrality. She had closed the circle before he even knew the circle existed. Malcolm Vexley looked out the window at the city sliding past and felt for perhaps the first time something he could only describe as genuine admiration, and it was one of the most terrifying feelings he had ever experienced. Because Evelina Renford Vexley, quiet and forgiving and endlessly patient, had spent 14 months building something, while he had spent 14 months believing he was completely safe. And now he was walking into his father's office with a 17-page financial disclosure in his hand, a pregnant wife who had just outmaneuvered him on every front, and a mistress who was already being gently guided toward cooperation by the same woman Malcolm had spent years underestimating. The car stopped. He got out. The elevator to the 43rd floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, his father's assistant, a thin, careful man named Gregory, who had worked for Alistair Vexley for over 20 years, was waiting. "He's expecting you," Gregory said, and his face told Malcolm nothing. Gregory's face never told anyone anything. That was why Alistair kept him. Malcolm walked past him without a word. The door to his father's office was heavy dark wood, and it opened silently the way expensive things do. Alistair Vexley was standing at the window, not at his desk, which was unusual. He was looking out at the city with his hands behind his back, and he did not turn when Malcolm entered. "Close the door," he said. Malcolm did. Show me. Malcolm laid the envelope and the papers on his father's desk. Alistair turned, crossed the room, and picked them up without sitting. He read standing, which was how he read everything he said. Sitting made you passive. Malcolm had heard that lesson 20 times. He watched his father's face. Alistair Vexley was 71 years old, and he had the face of a man who had never once been surprised by human failure because he had built his empire on a detailed understanding of exactly what people were capable of when no one was watching. He had hard gray eyes and a jaw that had not softened with age, and as he read through the pages, his expression did not change. Then he reached the line about Isabella, and his jaw shifted, just slightly, just enough. He set the papers down. The Bridgewater Fund, he said. I can explain. I don't want an explanation, Alistair said. I want to know how she found this. An intelligence firm. She's been building the file for 14 months. 14 months. Something moved behind his father's eyes. Not surprise, calculation. While you were sleeping, she was working. Dad, do not dad me right now. The voice was quiet, but it landed like a fist. You have exposed this family to a catastrophic degree of legal liability because you could not manage your personal life like an adult. He paused. The Cayman accounts. What's in them? Malcolm met his father's eyes, and in that moment, in the silence between the question and the answer, Malcolm understood something he had never quite fully understood before. He was not the most important thing in this room. He had never been the most important thing in his father's calculations. The empire was, the name was, the empire and the name and the legacy that Alistair Vexley had spent 50 years constructing from a mid-sized family business into one of the most powerful private holding companies on the eastern seaboard. There's more in those accounts than what she's shown you, Alistair said quietly. It was not a question. Yes. How much more? Malcolm told him. His father was quiet for a long time. Then we have work to do, Alistair said finally, and very little time to do it. He looked at his son with those hard gray eyes. You're going to do exactly what I tell you, and you are not going to contact Evelina again without my counsel in the room. She's carrying my son, Malcolm said. Something shifted in his father's face, just slightly. Is she? She told me today. A pause. And then Alistair Vexley did something Malcolm had not seen him do in years. He turned back to the window. A grandson, he said quietly. He stood there a moment. Then, get Gregory. Tell him I need the legal team here by noon. He didn't look at Malcolm again, and Malcolm stood in the center of his father's office with those papers scattered on the desk and felt the walls of a trap he hadn't known he was standing in begin to close inch by inch around all three of them. He had walked out of his own house this morning thinking the worst thing that could happen today was a difficult conversation. He had been wrong. The difficult conversation was already over. What was coming next was something else entirely. Gregory closed the office door behind him without a sound, and the room became something sealed, the kind of space where decisions get made that never appear in any public record. Alistair Vexley had not moved from the window. That was the thing about his father that had always unsettled Malcolm, even as a child, the stillness. Most powerful men performed their power. They moved fast, spoke sharp-filled rooms with the energy of someone who needed you to know they were important. Alistair did the opposite. He went quiet, he went still. And somehow that stillness was heavier than anything Malcolm had ever seen a man do in a boardroom. 14 months, Alistair said again. He was still looking at the city. She started this 14 months ago. That's what she told me. And you had no idea. It was not a question. Malcolm answered it anyway. No. Alistair finally turned. He crossed the room and sat behind his desk slowly, deliberately, and folded his hands on top of the papers Evelina's lawyers had assembled. He looked down at them the way a general looks at a map of territory he has already lost and is trying to figure out how to retake. Tell me about the compliance officer, he said. I don't know his name. She didn't give me his name. She wouldn't. That's what you do when you have a witness. You protect the name until you need it in court. Alistair picked up one page, studied it, set it down. She's not operating alone. This level of financial forensics tracing the Cayman transfers, identifying the Delaware LLC that requires a specialist. Not just an intelligence firm. Someone with banking experience, possibly someone who has worked inside a regulatory body. You think she has someone from the SEC? I think she has someone who knows exactly where the lines are and how far over them you've stepped. His father looked up. The question is not what she has, Malcolm. The question is what she plans to do with it. She's using it for the divorce. Is she? Alistair said it flatly. She has evidence of offshore transfers, illegal corporate movement, a $5 million payment to a third party that cannot be explained through any legitimate business channel, and she's using it for a divorce settlement. He paused. Does that sound like Evelina Renford to you? Malcolm opened his mouth, closed it. Because no, it didn't. He knew Evelina's family. Her father, Charles Renford, had built his own reputation on a 30-year career in securities law before moving into private practice, and the Renford name in New York, legal circles, carried the kind of weight that opened doors other people didn't even know existed. Evelina had grown up watching her father dismantle corporate fraud cases at the dinner table. She had a law degree herself, corporate from Penn, though she had never practiced. Malcolm had always privately considered that a convenience for him. He was reconsidering that now. She's not just filing for divorce, Malcolm said slowly. She is filing for divorce, Alistair said, and she is doing something else simultaneously. The divorce is the public move. It's the thing that gets announced, that creates narrative, that puts your name in a certain context in the minds of anyone who hears it. He leaned forward. The other thing, the financial documentation, the witness, the offshore records, that is the leverage. And leverage, son, is not something you use. It's something you hold until you decide what you want. What does she want? That, his father said, is what we need to find out before she tells us. Because the moment she tells us, we have lost the initiative. He reached for his phone and pressed a single button. Gregory, get me Arthur Weiss. And call Stern, tell him I need him in this office in 2 hours. Yes, both of them. He set the phone down. Arthur Weiss was the most expensive divorce attorney in Manhattan. Richard Stern was something else, a man whose name appeared on no firm's website, whose number was not in any public directory, and whose services Alistair Vexley had used exactly 3 times in 40 years. Each time a problem that should have destroyed something had instead quietly disappeared. Malcolm watched his father make those 2 calls and felt the ground shift beneath him in a way it hadn't since he was a child, and realized for the first time that his father's world operated by completely different rules than the one he'd been taught to believe in. Dad? His voice came out lower than he intended. She's pregnant. She's 7 months pregnant with my son. Alistair looked at him. I know that. I'm not whatever we do here. I'm not going to let anything happen to her, or the baby. His father was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not softness exactly, but acknowledgement, the recognition of a variable he had to account for. No one is going to touch Evelina, he said carefully, or the child. That is not what I'm suggesting. Then what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Alistair said, that we get ahead of this. That we understand exactly what she's built before it becomes public, that we explore every legal avenue to contain the damage to this company and this family. He met his son's eyes. And I'm suggesting that you stop thinking about this as a marriage and start thinking about it as what it actually is. And what is that? A war, Alistair said simply. That has already started, without your knowledge, without your consent, and with a 14-month head start on her side. The word landed in Malcolm's chest like something physical. War. He had driven home this morning with roses on the passenger seat. He had been planning an apology. He had been thinking about what they were having for dinner. His wife had been at war with him for over a year. His phone buzzed on the desk between them. Both men looked at it. Isabella again. Alistair looked at the name on the screen and then looked at his son with an expression that contained in its absolute restraint more contempt than most men could manage with their whole face. Turn it off, he said. Malcolm turned it off. At that exact moment, 3 floors below in the building's lobby, a woman in a dark coat walked in from the street, crossed to the elevator bank, and pressed the button for the 38th floor. She carried a slim leather briefcase and moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her name was Dara Cole, and she was not there for Alistair Vexley. She was there for this meeting she had scheduled 6 weeks ago with the managing director of Vexley Industries' primary lender, a meeting that had nothing to do with Evelina's divorce, and everything to do with what happened to a lending relationship when a borrower's key principal became the subject of a federal financial investigation. Dara Cole had been a federal prosecutor for 11 years before Evelina Renford hired her. She had stopped practicing law 3 years ago and started doing something more effective, building cases that other people could use. She was not Evelina's lawyer. She was Evelina's architect, and the building she had been designing for 14 months was almost complete. 2 hours passed in Alistair's office the way difficult hours do, fast on the surface, grinding underneath. Arthur Weiss arrived first, all silver hair and careful language, and spent 40 minutes reviewing the divorce papers with the expression of a man who has seen bad situations and recognized this one as worse than most, but not, professionally speaking, beyond management. He outlined the standard response strategy challenge: the financial disclosures move to delay, seek a private mediator, keep the proceedings out of public record as long as possible. Richard Stern arrived without knocking. He was a small man, unremarkable in every visible way, which Malcolm suspected was not an accident. He sat down, accepted no coffee, and listened while Weiss summarized the situation. Then he asked 3 questions. Who is the intelligence firm she used? We don't know yet, Alistair said. The compliance officer with the sworn statement. Has he been deposed? Not yet. The divorce was only filed 3 days ago. Stern nodded. And the Delaware LLC is the registering attorney still in communication with anyone inside your organization? Malcolm and his father looked at each other. He may have received communications in the last 6 months, Malcolm said carefully. Stern wrote something down on the small pad he had brought. Then he looked up. The LLC is the problem, he said. Everything else in that disclosure is serious, but it's the kind of serious that attorneys manage every day. The LLC, specifically the transfer to the personal account, that is the thing that crosses from civil to potential criminal exposure. He said it without drama, the way you describe weather. The question is whether she has already shared any of this with a regulatory body, or whether she is holding it exclusively for the divorce proceeding. If she shared it with the SEC, Weiss began. Then the divorce is the least of our concerns, Stern finished. Correct. The room was quiet. Malcolm felt something crawling up the back of his neck. He had spent the last 2 hours telling himself this was a divorce. A painful, expensive, complicated divorce, but ultimately a private matter between 2 people and their lawyers. The kind of thing wealthy families navigated quietly with sealed documents and negotiated settlements and the shared understanding that exposure was bad for everyone. But Stern had just said the word that changed the shape of everything. Criminal. We need to know, Alistair said quietly, whether she has already made contact with federal investigators. Yes, Stern agreed. And if she has... Stern looked at Alistair Vexley for a moment. Then your window for voluntary cooperation, which is always the better path in these situations, is closing. Quickly. Malcolm stood up. He couldn't sit anymore. He walked to the far side of the room and stood with his back to the 3 men at the desk, his hands pressed flat against the wall, and breathed. He thought about Evelina standing in the conservatory, the charcoal dress. The envelope held at her side like she'd been carrying it so long it had become part of her. The way she had looked at him, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something so much more devastating than either of those things. Clarity. She had looked at him with absolute clarity, like she could see every layer of him at once and had already accounted for all of them. Malcolm. His father's voice. He turned. We need to know about the emails, Alistair said. The temperature in the room dropped. What emails? Weiss asked. There were communications, Malcolm said slowly, between me and the attorney who set up the LLC, and between me and a former board member, about the Bridgewater acquisition. What did those communications say? Weiss asked. Malcolm looked at his father. Alistair looked back at him steadily. No expression, just the gray eyes and the waiting. They were specific, Malcolm said finally. about the intent of the transfers, about the reason the board member was compensated for his position on the vote. Weiss set down his pen. Stern did not react visibly, but he wrote something else on his pad. "Were those communications on encrypted servers?" Stern asked. "Yes, separate devices, everything I knew to do." "But they exist." "Yes, they exist." The silence in the room had a texture now, something heavy and close. "Does she have them?" Alistair asked. "I don't know," Malcolm said. "I don't know what she has. I showed you what she showed me, and I don't know what she's still holding back." Stern stood up. He smoothed his jacket, picked up his pad, and looked at Alistair. "I need 48 hours, he said. "I'll have a clearer picture of the exposure by then. In the meantime, no contact with the LLC attorney, no contact with the board member in question, and absolutely no contact with Ms. Dubois through any channel that could be documented." He looked at Malcolm. "Including personal devices." "Understood," Malcolm said. Stern left. Weiss followed 5 minutes later, a folder of papers under his arm and a list of questions he said he'd send by end of day. Father and son were alone again. Alistair poured 2 glasses of water. Not because either of them was particularly thirsty, Malcolm suspected, but because it gave the moment a shape, a ritual. He set one in front of Malcolm. "Sit down," he said. Malcolm sat. "I'm going to tell you something," Alistair said, "that I have never told you before. Because I didn't think you needed to hear it. I think you need to hear it now." Malcolm waited. "The Bridgewater acquisition," Alistair said. "The board vote. The arrangement with Harmon." He named the former board member, a man named Gerald Harmon, who had retired from the Vexley Industries board 18 months ago with a very generous severance package and a private understanding that certain things would remain unspoken. "That was not your idea." Malcolm looked at him. "I know," he said. "You suggested." "I didn't suggest it," Alistair said. "I designed it. You executed it because I asked you to, because that is how I have always operated this company." He looked at his son without apology and without shame. "I am telling you this now, because whatever Stern finds in the next 48 hours, if those emails exist, they may lead somewhere beyond you." The words settled slowly. Malcolm felt something cold move through him. "They could lead to you," he said. "They could lead to the company," Alistair corrected carefully, "which is the same thing legally speaking in certain configurations." He picked up his water glass. "I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this so that you understand the full dimension of what is at stake. This is not only your life, Malcolm. This is everything I have built, everything your grandfather built before me, everything that will belong to your son." There it was, the grandson card. Malcolm looked at his father and felt something complicated move through him, something that had no clean name, that was part love and part fury and part grief and part the particular exhaustion of being someone's son when that someone has always cared more about the empire than the emperor. "She knew that," Malcolm said quietly. Alistair looked at him. "What?" "Evelina. She knew that if she built a case against me, it wouldn't stop at me. She knew it would lead to you." He paused. "That's what the case is. It's not a divorce strategy. It's not about money. She's built a case against Vexley Industries." He looked at his father. "Against you." The silence stretched between them. Alistair's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Something shifted, some calculation recalibrated, some variable reassigned to a different column. "She is more like her father than I gave her credit for," he said quietly. "Yes," Malcolm said, "she is." His phone, which he had turned off at his father's instruction, was sitting on the corner of the desk. He looked at it, thought about Evelina standing at that window watching his car pull away, thought about what she had said about the baby, because of him, not despite the baby, because of him. She wasn't doing this out of revenge, she was doing it out of protection. She was 7 months pregnant, and she had decided somewhere in the last 14 months that the world her son was going to be born into needed to be different from the one Malcolm had built. And she had gone about making that happen with the same precision and patience that her father had used to build a 30-year legal career. And Malcolm had been driving around with roses on his passenger seat. He picked up the phone and turned it back on. 14 missed calls. 3 from Isabella. 2 from numbers he didn't recognize, 1 from a name that made his blood go cold in a completely different way. Gerald Harmon. He looked at his father. "Harmon called me," he said. Alistair's jaw tightened. Today, this morning, while I was—" He checked the timestamp. 40 minutes after I left the house. They looked at each other. "She contacted him," Malcolm said. "Or someone on her team did. She got to him before we even knew there was a problem." His father was quiet for a very long moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was running calculations that he would not share, that led to decisions Malcolm would not be told about until they were already made. "Dad." Malcolm's voice was different now, stripped of the performance, stripped of the practiced control. Just his voice, the way it actually sounded. "What do we do?" Alistair Vexley looked at his son. And for the first time, Malcolm saw something in his father's face that he had genuinely never seen before. Not fear. Alistair Vexley did not fear, but something close to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood. "We find out what Gerald Harmon told her," Alistair said. "And we find out today." He reached for his phone again, but before he touched it, Malcolm's own phone lit up with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it. 4 words, "We need to talk." And then 2 seconds later, a second message. "I'm not who you think I am." The sender was listed only by a number, no name, no contact saved. But below the second message, the sender had included a single file, an image. Malcolm opened it, and the floor dropped out of the world. It was a photograph. Taken from a distance, slightly blurred at the edges, the kind of photograph taken with a long lens from across a street or a park. It showed 2 people sitting across from each other at a small table, in what appeared to be a private dining room. One of them was Gerald Harmon. The other was Alistair Vexley. The timestamp in the corner of the image read, 14 months ago to the week. Malcolm looked up at his father, and Alistair Vexley, who had spent 71 years never being surprised, looked at the phone in his son's hand and went very, very still. Malcolm held the phone out toward his father without a word. Alistair looked at it, not at Malcolm, at the screen, at the photograph. And the stillness that had always been his signature, that controlled impenetrable stillness, that had closed 1,000 deals and silenced 1,000 rooms, cracked. Not visibly, not in any way that a stranger would notice. But Malcolm had spent 44 years studying his father's face, and he saw it. The infinitesimal tightening around the eyes, the single, barely perceptible breath drawn slightly deeper than the last. "Where did this come from?" Alistair asked. "Unknown number. 2 texts, then the image." "When was it sent? 11 minutes ago." Alistair straightened. He did not reach for the phone. He looked at it for another 3 seconds, and then he looked at his son, and Malcolm understood immediately that whatever was about to come out of his father's mouth was not going to be the truth. It was going to be a version of the truth, shaped, managed. The way everything Alistair Vexley said was shaped and managed even to his own son, even in a room with no witnesses. "That meeting happened," Alistair said. "Gerald and I had lunch 14 months ago. That is not unusual. He was still on the board at that time." "He left the board 11 months ago," Malcolm said. "Correct. So 14 months ago, he was still a board member, and having lunch with the chairman of the company he sat on the board of is not in any legal sense remarkable." "Then why does someone want me to see a picture of it?" Alistair's jaw moved, once. Then he walked back to his desk and sat down. "Someone is trying to tell you something," he said carefully. "The question is whether that someone is on Evelina's side or whether they are operating independently." "Or," Malcolm said, and his voice had an edge now that surprised even him, "someone is trying to warn me about you." The words sat between them like a lit match dropped on dry paper. His father looked at him. "Meaning what exactly?" Alistair said. "Meaning you told me 20 minutes ago that the Bridgewater arrangement was your design, that I executed it because you asked me to, and now someone has sent me a photograph of you and Gerald Harmon together taken 14 months ago with no explanation except we need to talk, and I'm not who you think I am." Malcolm set the phone on the desk between them. "So I'm asking you directly, Dad, what happened at that lunch?" Silence. Not the calculating kind. A different kind. The kind that comes before a confession or before a lie so large it needs a moment to fully assemble itself. "Gerald Harmon came to me," Alistair said finally. "He told me he had been approached by someone asking questions about Bridgewater, about the fund, about the transfers." Malcolm went very still. 14 months ago, he said. "Yes. Someone was investigating Bridgewater 14 months ago, and you knew, and you didn't tell me. I was handling it." "You were handling?" Malcolm stopped, breathed, started again. "Someone was investigating my finances, my corporate transfers, my exposure, and you sat across from me at dinner every Sunday for 14 months and said nothing." "I said I was handling it." "And did you—" Malcolm's voice broke slightly on the last word, not from weakness, but from the specific kind of fury that only comes from being protected by someone in a way that looks exactly like betrayal. "Did you handle it? Because from where I'm standing, Dad, whatever you did 14 months ago did not handle anything. She has a compliance officer's sworn statement. She has wire transfer confirmations. She has a photograph of you and Harmon that someone thought was important enough to send to me an hour into what is already the worst day of my life." Alistair said nothing. "What did you do?" Malcolm asked. A long pause. "I spoke to Gerald," Alistair said. "I explained the risk to him personally if he cooperated with whoever was asking questions. I reminded him of the terms of his severance. I made it clear that his cooperation was both expected and necessary." "You threatened him." "I informed him of his obligations. And he agreed. He agreed." "And then," Malcolm said slowly, the shape of it assembling itself in real time, "someone else got to him. Someone who offered him something more compelling than a threat." The silence confirmed it better than any answer could. Dara Cole had been a federal prosecutor for 11 years. She knew exactly how to approach a frightened man with corporate liability exposure. She knew what to offer him. She knew what language to use and what guarantees to put in writing and how to make the risk of silence feel greater than the risk of speaking. Gerald Harmon had been threatened by Alistair Vexley 14 months ago, and then he had been turned by Evelina's team. And whoever had sent that photograph knew both things and wanted Malcolm to know them too. His phone buzzed again. Same unknown number, this time just text. No image. "She has the emails, Malcolm. All of them. And she's not the one you should be afraid of right now." He read it twice. Then he looked up at his father. "She has the emails," he said. Alistair's expression didn't change, but his hands folded on the desk pressed slightly harder against each other. Malcolm saw the whitening of the knuckles. "How is that possible?" Malcolm said. "They were on encrypted servers, separate devices. I was careful." "You were careful," Alistair said. "I do not know if everyone around you was equally careful." "What does that mean?" "It means," Alistair said, "that encrypted communications require every party in the exchange to maintain the same standard of security. If any one of them, the LLC attorney Harmon, anyone who received or sent those messages stored copies on an insufficiently secured device, those copies could have been obtained." "Obtained by who? By a private intelligence firm." "Or by a federal agency," Alistair said quietly, "if someone opened a door." The room felt like it was contracting. If Gerald Harmon had gone to a federal agency, if he had walked into a field office 14 months ago with printed emails and a story about being coerced by the chairman of Vexley Industries, if Evelina's team, specifically Dara Cole, with her 11 years of federal prosecution experience, had used that as the foundation of a parallel track that ran alongside the divorce case Invisible structured, aimed not at a settlement, but at an indictment. Malcolm picked up his phone and called the unknown number. It rang 4 times. Then a voice answered. Male. Calm. Professional in the specific way of someone who has spent years in institutions where professionalism is armor. "Mr. Vexley," the voice said, "I was wondering when you'd call." "Who are you?" "My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that I have information you need, and I have about 10 minutes before the people I work with realize I've gone off script." "What people?" "That also doesn't matter. What matters is this. Your wife is a good woman, Mr. Vexley. She is doing what she believes is right. But there is a piece of this that she doesn't fully control anymore, and that piece is moving faster than anyone on her team realizes." Malcolm stood up, walked to the far side of the room. His father watched him but did not move. "What piece?" Malcolm said. "The federal side," the voice said. "An investigation was opened 8 months ago, not by her, not by her lawyers, independently based on a referral from a bank compliance officer who filed a suspicious activity report 18 months ago. Your wife's team found out about the investigation 5 months ago and has been coordinating with it, building parallel documentation, sharing evidence through channels that are technically legal but let's say creative." A pause. "The investigation is further along than your wife knows, and it is about to become very public, possibly within days." Malcolm's hand tightened on the phone. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the person in the most danger right now is not you," the voice said. "Your exposure is significant, but your father's is catastrophic. And if Alistair Vexley goes down under a federal investigation, the collateral damage extends to every person connected to that company. Employees, partners, vendors, the pension funds of about 3,000 people who have never done anything wrong and have no idea their retirement depends on a company that has been moving dirty money for 2 decades. A pause. "I'm telling you because someone should, and because the window for you to make a different choice than your father is closing. Fast." The line went dead. Malcolm stood with the phone at his side and looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The skyline of the city spread out behind him, indifferent and enormous, and his own face looking back at him like a question he had been refusing to answer for years. He turned around. His father was watching him with those gray eyes, perfectly composed, perfectly unreadable. "A federal investigation," Malcolm said. Alistair did not blink. "What did they tell you?" "That it's been open for 8 months, that Evelina's team has been coordinating with it, that it's about to go public." "They," Alistair said. "Who is they?" "I don't know." "A voice on a phone," Alistair said. "An anonymous photograph, an unknown number." He spread his hands slightly. "Malcolm, think about what you're doing. Someone is feeding you information through unverifiable channels at exactly the moment when you are most emotionally compromised. That is a manipulation strategy. That is how you destabilize someone's judgment. You wait until they're frightened, and then you give them more things to be frightened of. Or, Malcolm said, it's how someone who knows the truth gets it to the one person who still has time to act on it. And what action are you imagining taking?" The question sat there. Malcolm looked at his father, really looked at him, not as the man who had raised him, not as the architect of the empire he had inherited, not as the voice on the phone he called when something went wrong, just as a man. 71 years old, silver-haired, controlled, brilliant, and probably the reason that everything Malcolm had built over the last 6 years was about to come apart. "I'm going to call Richard Stern back," Malcolm said. "Good. And I'm going to tell him everything, including what you just told me about designing the Bridgewater arrangement, including your meeting with Harmon, including the fact that you knew someone was investigating 14 months ago and chose to handle it with a threat instead of a lawyer." Alistair's expression did not change. "That would be inadvisable." "Why?" "Because anything you tell Stern becomes part of a legal strategy. A legal strategy requires a client. If you tell Stern that I designed the arrangement, you are making me a subject of the legal matter, which means I need separate counsel, which means the information is now in multiple hands, which means the probability of a leak increases by—" "Dad," Malcolm's voice cut through the calculation cleanly. "Stop. Just stop." Alistair stopped. "I am not a move on your board," Malcolm said. "I understand that you have treated me that way my entire life. I understand that to you everything is a board, and everyone on it is a piece that either advances your position or threatens it. But I am not doing that anymore. I am not protecting a strategy. I have a son who is going to be born in 2 months into a world where his grandfather may be indicted, and his father's company is under federal investigation, and his mother is the only person in this entire situation who has actually been acting in his interest." Something shifted in Alistair's face. Not collapse, not remorse, but some slow, grinding tectonic movement behind the eyes of a man who had not allowed himself to feel the weight of another person's reality in a very long time. "What do you want me to do?" Alistair said. And the question came out differently than Malcolm expected, less controlled. more real. "I want you to tell me everything," Malcolm said. "Not the version you've been managing, everything. Because I cannot make a decision about what to do next if I don't know the full shape of what we're standing in." A long, long pause. And then Alistair Vexley did something Malcolm had seen him do perhaps 3 times in his entire life. He looked away. Not at the window, not at the city. Just away. At some middle distance that had nothing in it except the weight of what he was about to say. "The Cayman accounts," he began. "The original structure was put in place 11 years ago, before you were involved in the company at a senior level, before the Bridgewater deal, before any of what is in those divorce papers." He paused. "The LLC you created for the Isabella payment was connected to those accounts not because of the payment itself, but because of the architecture I built around them. You created a thread that led without your knowledge back to the original structure." Malcolm let that sink in. "How much?" he said. Alistair told him. Malcolm sat down, not because he chose to, because his legs made the decision independently. The number his father had just given him was not the number in Evelina's papers. It was not the number Stern would find in the next 48 hours. It was a number so much larger than anything Malcolm had been calculating that it reframed everything: the divorce, the investigation, the risk, the possible outcomes in one sentence. "She doesn't know," Malcolm said. It was not a question. "She knows about the surface," Alistair said. "What her team has found is real, and it is serious, and it is enough. But they are looking at the branches. They have not yet found the root." "And if they do," Alistair was quiet. "If they find the root," Malcolm said, "this is not a corporate restructuring. This is not a settlement. This is not a consent decree with the SEC." He looked at his father. "This is prison." Alistair did not deny it, and that the absence of denial from a man who had spent 71 years denying everything was the most terrifying thing Malcolm Vexley had ever witnessed. His phone buzzed one more time. Not the unknown number this time. Evelina. One message. No preamble. "My lawyer will be at your father's office at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Not to negotiate. To deliver something. I thought you should know before it arrives." Malcolm looked at the time. It was 12:47. 2 hours and 13 minutes. He looked at his father. He looked at the papers on the desk. He looked at the photograph still glowing on his phone screen. His father and Gerald Harmon 14 months ago, in a private dining room having a conversation that had set this entire machine in motion without Malcolm ever knowing the machine existed. He thought about Evelina in the conservatory that morning. The charcoal dress, the envelope, the way she had said because of him, not despite the baby, because of him. He thought about a boy who had not yet been born, who would come into the world in 2 months and spend the rest of his life inheriting whatever Malcolm did or failed to do in the next 2 hours and 13 minutes. And Malcolm Vexley, who had spent his entire adult life choosing the empire over everything else, felt something shift inside him. Not dramatic, not sudden, but deep. Like a fault line settling into a new position. Like a building that has been leaning for years, finally acknowledging the direction of its fall. He picked up his phone. He did not call Stern. He did not call Arthur Weiss. He did not call Isabella or the LLC attorney or anyone in the architecture his father had built around him. He opened his contacts, scrolled to a name he had not called in 3 years, and pressed dial. The phone rang twice. "Charles," Malcolm said. "It's Malcolm. I need to speak to Evelina's father. I know what time it is. I know what's happening. And I know that you are the one person in this situation who might still be willing to hear what I have to say before 3 o'clock. A pause on the other end. Charles Renford, 30 years in securities law. The man whose name opened doors no one else could find, breathed once slowly, and then said 4 words. "I'm listening. Go ahead." And in the 43rd floor office, Alistair Vexley watched his son make that call, and for the first time in 71 years of building and protecting and calculating, he did not reach out to stop what was happening. He just sat there, and something that might have been grief or might have been the long-delayed recognition of consequence moved across his face like a shadow crossing open ground. Malcolm talked. Charles Renford listened, and 2 hours and 12 minutes remained before everything changed again. Charles Renford listened for 19 minutes without interrupting once. That was the thing about him. The thing Malcolm had always found slightly unnerving at family dinners and holiday gatherings, back when those things still happened, back when the word family still applied to this particular configuration of people. Charles Renford did not fill silence. He let it exist. He let you exist inside it with all your words and all your implications and all the things you were trying not to say, and he just listened. And when you were done, the silence continued for another few seconds before he responded, because Charles Renford believed that the most revealing thing a person said was usually the thing they said right after they thought the conversation was over. Malcolm had talked for 19 minutes. He had told Charles everything: the Bridgewater transfers, the LLC Isabella, the $5 million, the emails, the federal investigation that had been running for 8 months without his knowledge, and finally the number his father had given him 40 minutes ago. The real number. The root beneath the branches. He told Charles Renford everything because Charles Renford was the only person left in this situation who had not yet been compromised by it, and because Malcolm was operating now on an instinct he had suppressed for so long, he barely recognized it when it surfaced. The instinct to tell the truth. When he finished, the silence lasted 11 seconds. Malcolm counted. Then Charles spoke. "How much of what you just told me does Evelina know?" "The branches," Malcolm said. "What's in the papers, not the root." "And your father, does he know you're making this call?" "He's sitting 12 feet away from me." A pause. "Is he listening?" Malcolm looked at his father, who was looking back at him with an expression of absolute composure that cost Malcolm, now understood, enormous effort to maintain. "Probably," Malcolm said. "All right," Charles breathed once. "Malcolm, I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly, not strategically, not with the version that protects you or protects the company. Honestly." "Okay." "Why are you calling me—" Malcolm opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the window at the city, at the reflection of himself and his father in the glass. "Because I want my son to be born into something that isn't this," he said. Another silence. Shorter this time. "Stay where you are," Charles said. "Don't speak to your father's lawyers. Don't speak to Stern. Don't contact Evelina directly. I'm going to make a call and then I'm going to call you back. Give me 30 minutes. "The delivery arrives at 3. "I know what arrives at 3, Charles said quietly. "I approved it." And he hung up. Malcolm lowered the phone. Alistair was watching him. "Charles Renford," Alistair said. It was not a question. "Yes." "You told him the full amount?" "Yes." Something passed through his father's face, not anger, which Malcolm would have expected, but something more complex and harder to name, something that looked almost like resignation, which on Alistair Vexley's face was as foreign as sunlight on a north-facing wall. "You understand what you've done," Alistair said. "I've given someone honest information for the first time in a very long time," Malcolm said. "Yes, I understand what I've done." "You've handed Charles Renford the root." Alistair's voice was level. "Everything above it, the branches, the transfers, the documentation, Evelina has already built that was manageable. Painful, expensive, reputationally damaging, but manageable. The root is not manageable. The root is 22 years of fraud," Malcolm said. "I know what it is, Dad. You told me 30 minutes ago." The word fraud sat in the room between them. Alistair had not used that word. He had used words like structure and architecture and original arrangement. Malcolm was using the right word now, deliberately, and watching his father's face absorb it. "I have been protecting this family," Alistair said. "You have been protecting the empire," Malcolm said. "Those are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing, and I think you know that, and I think somewhere in the last 20 minutes you started to feel the difference." Alistair said nothing. "I have a son coming," Malcolm said. "I know I've said that 3 times today. I know you think I'm using it emotionally like a lever. I'm not. I'm saying it because it's the only true thing I know right now. Everything else in this room, the company, the accounts, the investigation, your legacy, my reputation, all of it is negotiable. All of it can be restructured or settled or reframed. My son's life cannot be restructured. He gets one. And he gets whatever foundation I build for him in the next 2 hours and 13, he checked the time, 2 hours and 3 minutes. Alistair looked at his son for a long time. Then he said very quietly, Your grandfather started this company with $40,000 and a contract he won by bribing a city inspector. Malcolm blinked. I have known that my entire life, Alistair continued. I inherited a company built on a bribe. I told myself that what I built on top of it was legitimate, that the original sin was my father's, not mine, that I had simply inherited a foundation and built something real above it. He paused. But you cannot build something clean on a foundation that is dirty. The dirt works its way up. It always does. The room was so quiet, Malcolm could hear the ventilation system. I told myself the same thing, Malcolm said. About what you built. About what I inherited. Alistair nodded. Once. Slowly. Yes, he said. I imagine you did. And for 30 seconds, father and son sat in the same silence. Not the strategic silence of men calculating their next move, but the raw, exhausted silence of two people looking at the same wreckage and finally agreeing on what it is. Then Malcolm's phone rang. Charles Renford. 18 minutes ahead of schedule. Malcolm answered. I've spoken to Evelina, Charles said immediately. No preamble. And I've spoken to Dara Cole. Here is where we are. The delivery scheduled for 3 o'clock is a second set of documents. Not the divorce papers, those are already filed. This is a referral package. Evidence compiled by Evelina's team prepared for voluntary submission to the U.S. Attorney's Office. A pause. It was always intended as a last resort, a contingency. Evelina hoped it would never need to be submitted. What changes whether it gets submitted? Malcolm asked. You do, Charles said. What you do in the next 90 minutes determines whether that package goes to a federal prosecutor or whether it gets placed in a drawer and the matter proceeds civilly. Malcolm stood up. Tell me exactly what she needs, he said. Full financial disclosure, Charles said. Everything, not the branches, the root. In writing, notarized, submitted to her legal team as the basis for a comprehensive civil settlement. Corporate restructuring with independent oversight, Malcolm's personal cooperation in the civil regulatory process, and a pause, Alistair's resignation from all active roles in Vexley Industries, effective immediately with no golden parachute, no severance structure, and no continuing influence. The last part landed like a stone dropped from a great height. Malcolm looked at his father. Alistair was looking back at him with those gray eyes, and Malcolm realized with a clarity that felt like cold water that his father had heard every word. Not because Malcolm had put the call on speaker, because Charles Renford had spoken loudly enough to be heard deliberately, because Charles Renford had been doing this for 30 years, and he understood that the most important person in this negotiation was not Malcolm. It was Alistair, and Alistair needed to hear the terms from the other side's mouth. One more thing, Charles said. Evelina's condition is personal, not legal. She wants to speak to Malcolm, directly, not through counsel, before 3 o'clock. Understood? Malcolm said. Malcolm? Charles's voice changed slightly, dropped the professional register just a fraction. Became briefly the voice of a father. My daughter has been through a great deal. Whatever you say to her, make sure it's real. She has excellent instincts for the other kind. I know, Malcolm said. She always did. He hung up. He looked at his father. Alistair was sitting very straight, very still, his hands folded on the desk, his face composed in the way that men compose their faces when they are performing dignity in the face of its absence. He had heard the terms. He understood what they meant. And Malcolm, looking at him now, saw something he had never expected to see his father, without the architecture of power around him, was just an old man who had made choices he could not unmake and was sitting in the last room those choices had led him to. They want your resignation, Malcolm said. Not cruelly, just clearly. I heard. Immediate, no severance, no continuing role. I heard Malcolm. A pause. Will you? Malcolm asked. His father looked at the desk for a long moment. At the papers, at the water glasses, at the Empire's documentation spread out in front of him. I built this company for 50 years, Alistair said. I know. Your grandfather's bribe bought a contract. I turned that contract into 100 contracts. I built divisions. I hired thousands of people. I created something that lasted beyond the original sin that started it. I know, Dad. And it is not nothing, Alistair said. "Whatever else it is not nothing." "No," Malcolm agreed. "It's not nothing." Silence. "But it needs to be rebuilt," Malcolm said, "and it can't be rebuilt with you in the chair, because you are the chair, you are the structure, and the structure is what has to change." Alistair looked at him for a long time. Then he reached forward slowly and pulled the papers on his desk into a neat stack. He straightened them against the surface, set them aside, folded his hands in the empty space they had left. "Go talk to your wife," he said. Malcolm didn't move immediately. "Dad." "Go," Alistair said. "I'll call Gregory. I'll have my attorney contacted." He looked at his hands. "Go talk to Evelina." Malcolm picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, picked up his phone, moved toward the door. "Malcolm." He stopped. "The boy," Alistair said. "When he's born." A pause. "I'd like to know him." The sentence was so uncharacteristically bare, so stripped of performance and strategy, and the usual management of everything Alistair Vexley said, that Malcolm stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. "That's not my decision," Malcolm said finally. "That's Evelina's." He left. The drive back to Greenwich took 34 minutes in midday traffic, and Malcolm spent every one of them with his hands on the wheel and his phone face down on the seat beside him. No calls, no messages, no management of anything. Just the road and the weight of what was coming. He had called Evelina's phone from the car. She had answered on the second ring, no greeting, just silence, which was the kind of silence that meant she was listening. He had said, "I'm coming home. I need to talk to you before 3. I'm not coming to fight. I'm coming because your father told me to make sure what I say is real, and I want to try." She had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Use the front door." He used the front door. Mrs. Patel was in the kitchen. The house had the same quality of careful stillness as that morning. Everything in its place. Everything deliberate. Malcolm walked through the foyer and turned not toward the conservatory, but toward the sitting room, where Evelina was waiting on the sofa, her legs tucked beneath her, a glass of water on the table beside her, her phone face down on the cushion. She was not in the charcoal dress anymore. She had changed into something softer, still deliberate, but different. The lawyer's armor was off. She was just Evelina. 7 months along, dark hair loose now around her shoulders, watching him cross the room with those steady brown eyes. He sat down across from her. Not beside her. Across. Appropriate distance for two people who were telling the truth to each other for possibly the first time. "I spoke to your father," Malcolm said. "I know, he called me. I told him everything. I know that too. I told him the number. The real number. The one that isn't in your papers." Something moved in Evelina's eyes, not surprise, but confirmation. The look of someone who suspected a thing and is now having it verified. "How much more?" she asked. He told her. She absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, without visible collapse, without the kind of reaction that gives the other person something to manage. She just took it in, processed it, and when she spoke again, her voice was level. "Your father," she said. 22 years, Malcolm said, before I was involved at a senior level. I inherited it without knowing the full structure. I added to it. I made it worse, but I did not build the foundation. That doesn't absolve you. I know I'm not asking for absolution." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Evie, I'm asking for, I don't know what to call it, a chance to do this differently than my father did it, to face what I've done instead of managing it, to give our son something that isn't built on the same foundation." Evelina looked at him for a long time. "You know what the hardest part was?" she said. "It wasn't the affair, it wasn't Isabella, it wasn't even the money or the corporate manipulation or the 14 months of building a case while you drove home with flowers and rehearsed apologies." She paused. "It was that I kept waiting for you to choose differently. Every time you came home, every time you sat across from me at dinner, every time you put your hand on my stomach and said you were excited. I kept thinking today he'll decide to be different." Her voice did not break. It simply became very quiet. Today never came. "I know," Malcolm said, "and now you're here because you're cornered." "I'm here because I called your father," he said. when I didn't have to. When my father's lawyers were in that room telling me to hold position and contain the damage. I called your father because I didn't want to hold position anymore. I'm tired of holding position, Evie. I'm tired of managing every room I walk into. He looked at her steadily. I'm not saying that makes me a good man. I'm saying it's the first true thing I've done in a very long time. A long silence. Evelina uncurled her legs and set her feet on the floor. She sat up straight and put both hands in her lap, the particular posture of a woman preparing to say something she has thought about for a long time. I don't want a reunion, she said. I want to be clear about that. The divorce proceeds. The settlement terms are what they are. The corporate restructuring happens with oversight transparently on the record. Agreed, Malcolm said. Your father resigns. Immediately. No negotiation on that point. He knows. He told me to come here. Something shifted very slightly in Evelina's expression. He sent you here. He told me to go talk to my wife. She looked at him for a moment, and in her eyes Malcolm saw something he had not expected, not softness for him, but something like grief for what might have been for the version of this story where the choices had been different years ago, and none of them were sitting in this room having this conversation. The full disclosure, she said, in writing, notarized, everything including what you told my father. Yes. And you testify, if it comes to a civil proceeding. You don't take the fifth, you don't delay, you don't instruct your lawyers to slow walk every request. Yes. And the company, she paused. The company survives Malcolm. The 3,000 employees, the pension funds, they didn't do anything wrong. The restructuring protects them. That's what I want too, he said. That was always, he stopped, because it wasn't always. That was not always what he had prioritized, and saying so would be the kind of lie that made everything else he'd said meaningless. That's what I want now, he said instead. Evelina nodded. Then she did something that Malcolm had not expected. She reached across the space between them, not to take his hand, not to offer comfort, but to pick up the glass of water from the table beside her. She held it for a moment, both hands around it, the way you hold something when you need something solid to hold. He kicked this morning, she said. Malcolm looked up, about 7 o'clock, right when I was getting dressed. She looked down at the curve of her belly. He kicks when I'm stressed, which means he's been very active lately. Malcolm didn't speak. He's going to need a father, Evelina said. Not the version you've been performing, a real one. I don't know if you know how to be that yet. I don't know if you can learn. She looked at him. But I think you have to try. Not for me, for him. I know, Malcolm said, because I will not raise a son who grows up in the shadow of a man who chose an empire over his family and then lost the empire anyway. That is not the story I want him to inherit. It's not the story I want to leave him, Malcolm said. And this time, unlike all the other times he had said things like this in practiced voices, in managed rooms, it was true. They sat together in the sitting room of the house that was no longer fully theirs, in the way it had once been, with 47 minutes left before 3 o'clock and everything still waiting to be done, and for a little while neither of them spoke. The clock on the wall marked the time. Outside, a car pulled up the driveway, a black sedan, not Malcolm's. A woman got out carrying a slim leather briefcase. She paused, checked her phone, and walked toward the front door. Dara Cole. Right on time, because Dara Cole was always right on time. Inside, Evelina heard the doorbell and stood. She smoothed her dress, straightened, and looked at Malcolm one last time. Whatever happens next, she said, happens on the record, in the open, no more management. No more management, Malcolm agreed. She walked to the door, and Malcolm Vexley sat alone in the room where his marriage had lived, holding none of the roses and none of the rehearsed lines with the truth laid out in front of him like a map of terrain he had spent his whole life avoiding. He picked up his phone. He called Richard Stern. I need you to come to Greenwich, he said, and I need you to come ready to work because what I'm about to tell you is going to change the scope of everything we discussed this morning. Stern paused. How significantly, Malcolm said, and through the wall he could hear Dara Cole's voice, measured, professional, precise, beginning the conversation that would determine the shape of everything that came next. He did not try to manage what she was saying. He just listened. And that, for Malcolm Vexley, was its own kind of beginning. Richard Stern arrived at the Greenwich estate at 2:41, 19 minutes before 3 o'clock, 19 minutes before Dara Cole's briefcase opened, and the referral package either went into the legal system or went back into a drawer, depending entirely on what had happened in the hours between Malcolm leaving his father's office and Stern walking through the front door of a house that felt like it was holding its breath. Stern did not look surprised by anything he saw. Stern never looked surprised. It was Malcolm had decided either his greatest professional asset or evidence of a complete absence of normal human response to extraordinary circumstances. Either way, it was useful right now. Malcolm met him in the hallway and spoke for 4 minutes without stopping. He gave Stern the route number. He gave him Alistair's admission about the original structure. He gave him the timeline, 11 years, 22 years, the grandfather's bribe, all of it. He watched Stern's face absorb the information. With the same neutral professionalism, it absorbed everything. And when Malcolm finished, Stern was quiet for exactly 6 seconds. "You understand," Stern said, "that what you've just told me changes your exposure significantly, in your favor." "I'm not doing this to change my exposure," Malcolm said. "I understand that," Stern said. "I'm telling you anyway because you need to know." He paused. "The original structure, if it predates your involvement at a senior level by the margin you're describing, and if that can be documented, your role shifts from architect to inheritor, which is still serious, but it is materially different in any federal proceeding." "Will it still go federal?" Malcolm asked. "That depends on what Evelina's team decides to do with the referral package," Stern said, "which depends on what happens in that room in the next 19 minutes. He looked at Malcolm steadily. "Is she going to submit it?" "I don't know," Malcolm said honestly. "I think it depends on whether she believes what I told her." "Does she have reason to believe you?" Malcolm thought about Evelina sitting across from him with the glass of water in her hands, saying he kicks when I'm stressed. Thought about the way she had looked at him, not with hope, not with forgiveness, but with the specific attention of a woman who had built a 14-month case on evidence and was now assessing one more piece of it. "She has reason to be skeptical," Malcolm said. "But she also has good instincts. Her father said so, and I think she heard something true." Stern nodded once. "Then let's go find out." They walked together toward the sitting room where Evelina and Dara Cole were waiting. Malcolm pushed the door open. Evelina was standing. Dara Cole was beside her. The briefcase on the table closed, its contents still inside it. Both women looked at Malcolm when he entered, and then at Stern, and then at each other. "Mr. Stern," Dara Cole said. "A professional acknowledgement. Nothing warm in it, nothing hostile." "Ms. Cole," Stern replied in exactly the same register. Malcolm looked at Evelina. She looked back at him. And in the silence between them something passed, not a word, not a gesture, but a kind of recognition. The acknowledgement of two people who had been in the same story for a very long time and were now finally reading the same page. "Malcolm told you everything," Evelina said. "It was not a question." "He told me what he told your father," Stern said. "And he asked me to come here to confirm on the record that he is prepared to cooperate fully with whatever civil process follows. Complete financial disclosure, including information beyond what is currently in your documentation. Corporate restructuring with independent oversight. No legal obstruction, no delays." Evelina looked at Dara. Dara Cole picked up the briefcase, held it for a moment, then set it back down on the table without opening it. "The referral package," Dara said, "stays here for now, pending fulfillment of the disclosure terms within 72 hours. She looked at Malcolm directly. "If anything in the disclosure is incomplete, withheld, or structured, to minimize rather than reveal the package goes to the U.S. Attorney that afternoon. No second chances, no renegotiation." "Understood," Malcolm said. "And Alistair Vexley's resignation," Evelina said, "in writing, before close of business today." "He's already called Gregory," Malcolm said. "His attorney is being contacted now." Something in Evelina's posture changed not much, but Malcolm had spent 14 years learning to read the small movements of this woman's body, and he caught it. A fraction of tension released from her shoulders. The briefest exhale. She had not been certain he would deliver that, and he had. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Stern and Cole sat across from each other at the dining room table that had hosted 100 family dinners and negotiated the terms of what would happen next, the timeline for disclosure, the structure of the oversight committee, the framework of the divorce settlement that would run parallel to the corporate restructuring. Malcolm sat at one end of the table and Evelina sat at the other, and they did not look at each other often, but when they did, it was without the managed distance of that morning. Something had shifted between them, not back toward what they had been, forward toward something that didn't have a name yet. At 4:17, Stern's phone rang. He looked at it, excused himself from the table, and stepped into the hallway. He came back 2 minutes later. "That was Gregory," he said. He looked at Malcolm. "Your father has signed the resignation letter, effective immediately, no severance, no continuing role." A pause. "He also asked Gregory to send you a message." Malcolm looked up. "What message?" Stern looked down at his phone, read from the screen. "Tell my son that the company is his now. Do with it what I couldn't." The room was quiet. Evelina looked at Malcolm. Malcolm looked at the table. He breathed once slowly through the specific weight of receiving something from his father that had no manipulation in it, no leverage, no calculation, just a sentence that cost Alistair Vexley everything to send and nothing to take back. "Okay," Malcolm said quietly. "Okay." Cole and Stern exchanged a brief professional glance. Then Cole closed her notebook and Stern capped his pen, and the meeting moved into its final administrative phase: signatures, notarizations, the procedural choreography of consequence being formally accepted. At 5:53, everyone left except Malcolm and Evelina. They were alone in the house that had never quite felt like a home, not because of the architecture or the furnishings or any quality of the physical space, but because of what had been missing in it for years. The thing that makes a house a home is not love exactly, it's truth. And there had been very little truth in these rooms for a very long time. "You should probably call a real estate attorney," Evelina said. She was standing in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of water. "About the estate, we'll need to agree on what happens to the property." "I know," Malcolm said. He was leaning against the doorframe, not entering the room fully, not retreating from it, just there in the threshold. "I'm staying through the birth," she said. "I'm not moving during the 3rd trimester. After that, I'll be looking at something in the city, closer to my parents." "That makes sense?" "I'm telling you, not asking for approval." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering approval. I'm just—" He paused. "I'm agreeing. I think that's the right choice." She looked at him over the rim of the glass, that steady brown gaze that had always seen more than he gave it credit for. "You called my father today," she said, "before you had to, when your lawyers were telling you to hold position." She set the glass down. "Why, I told you already." "You told me the reason that sounds good," she said. "I'm asking for the real one." Malcolm was quiet for a moment. "Because I heard you this morning," he said, "in the conservatory, not what you said, what you were." He met her eyes. "You were not angry. You were not broken. You were not the person I had told myself you were the one who would always forgive, always absorb, always let me be the version of myself I was most comfortable performing." He paused. "You were just yourself, completely. And I realized I had been married to that person for 14 years, and I had never once actually seen her clearly." He paused again. "That's not an excuse. It's not an apology. It's just what happened this morning when you handed me that envelope and walked out of the room." Evelina was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I saw you clearly too, today, for the first time in a long time." She picked up her glass. "I'm not sure what to do with that." "Neither am I," Malcolm said. "But it's something," she said, not warmly, not as a bridge toward reconciliation, just as an acknowledgement of a fact. "Yes," he said, "it's something." She nodded once, moved toward the hallway. "The guest room on the east wing," she said. "You can stay there tonight. You need to be here when the disclosure team arrives tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. "I'll be here." She stopped in the doorway, the same doorway where he was standing, so they were suddenly very close, closer than they had been all day, except for the moment in the sitting room when she had looked at him and said he kicks when I'm stressed. "Malcolm," she said. "Yes. If you do this, the real disclosure, the full cooperation, the restructuring, not because of the legal pressure, but because you actually mean it." She looked at him directly. "I will not keep our son from you. That's not a negotiating point. That's a promise. From me, not from my lawyers." Something in Malcolm's chest moved in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, walked past him toward the stairs. He stood in the kitchen doorway alone for a moment, listening to the sound of the house settling around him, the particular language of old buildings at the end of a long day. And then he pulled out his phone one final time. Not to call anyone, not to manage anything. He opened his contacts, scrolled to Isabella Dubois, and looked at the name for a long time. Then he dialed. She answered immediately, and he could hear the fear still in her voice, that high, brittle quality that had been there this morning and had not left. "Malcolm, I'm going to say this once," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it." He paused. "What we had is done. It should have been done before it started. I am not going to protect you from the legal process, and I am not going to help you avoid the consequences of decisions we both made." Another pause. "But I'm also not going to use you as a scapegoat. Your name is in the disclosure because the money went to your account. The circumstances around that will be accurately described. Not inflated, not manipulated." He breathed. "That's all I can give you. I think you should call the attorney Evelina recommended." A long silence. "That's it," Isabella said. Her voice was different now, smaller. "That's it," Malcolm said. "I'm sorry, Isabella, for what it's worth. I'm sorry for all of it." He hung up. He stood there a moment longer. Then he went to the guest room on the east wing, sat on the edge of the bed, and did nothing at all for a little while. Just sat there in the quiet of a house that was changing around him, in a life that was being rebuilt from a different kind of foundation than the one he'd inherited. 3 weeks later, the financial disclosure was submitted. All of it. The branches and the root and everything in between, 22 years of structured fraud laid out in the kind of language that leaves no ambiguity and no room for managed interpretation. Dara Cole's team reviewed it against their own documentation and confirmed it was complete. The referral package stayed in its drawer. The civil regulatory process began. Vexley Industries did not collapse. Malcolm had been right about that. The company itself, stripped of the corruption that had run through its foundations for 2 decades, was structurally sound. The portfolio was real, the employees were real, the partnerships were real. What had been wrong was not the business, but the man who had been running it, and the man who had built it before him. Under an independent oversight committee with a new executive team, with Malcolm in a restructured role that carried authority and accountability in equal measure, the company began the slow, unglamorous, necessary work of becoming something honest. Alistair Vexley did not fight the resignation terms. He did not appear in public. He did not give interviews. He moved quietly to the Connecticut house that had always been his private retreat, and he lived there with Gregory, who stayed because Gregory had worked for the man for 23 years, and apparently felt that loyalty had its own logic regardless of circumstance. He did not call Malcolm. Malcolm called him once on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks after the resignation, for no particular reason except that it was a Tuesday and he was driving and the phone was in the console, and some habits of the heart are harder to break than corporate structures. Alistair answered on the second ring. "How is she?" he said immediately. "Due in 3 weeks," Malcolm said. She's good. She's strong." "She was always strong," Alistair said. "I should have said so more often." "Yeah," Malcolm said. "Me too." A brief silence. "The Oversight Committee met this week," Malcolm said. "The Q3 numbers are Malcolm." His father's voice was gentle in a way Malcolm could not remember hearing before. "I don't need the numbers." A pause. "Okay," Malcolm said. "Tell me about the boy," Alistair said. "What are you going to name him?" And Malcolm, driving through early winter light on the Merritt Parkway, the city behind him and the house ahead, the whole broken and rebuilding landscape of his life, spread out in every direction, told his father the name. Alistair was quiet for a moment. "That's a good name," he said. "Evelina chose it," Malcolm said. "I agreed." Another silence, warmer than the ones before it. Good, Alistair said. That's how it should be. They talked for 11 minutes, not about the company, not about the legal proceedings or the oversight committee or the regulatory timeline. Just two men on a phone, a father and a son, finding their way back towards something smaller and more real than the empire that had consumed them both. When Malcolm pulled into the driveway of the Greenwich estate, still shared, still theirs, in the technical sense, still waiting to be redistributed by the attorneys when the time came, he sat in the car for a moment before going inside. The fountain in the circular driveway was still running. He had never actually stopped to listen to it before. It made a specific sound, not loud, not dramatic, just consistent. The steady movement of water that continued regardless of what was happening around it. He went inside. Evelina was in the kitchen, and she looked up when he came through the door, and she said nothing at first, just looked at him the way she had been looking at him recently, assessing careful, not unkind. "You called him," she said. "How did you know? You have a specific look when you've talked to your father. You've had it your whole life." She turned back to what she was doing. "How is he?" "Quiet," Malcolm said. I think he's processing." She said, not dismissive, just acknowledging. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where 100 difficult mornings had happened, where he had eaten breakfasts while composing lies and drunk coffee, while planning disappearances, and he sat there without performing anything, without managing the room or the moment or the woman 12 feet away from him. "He asked about the name," Malcolm said. Evelina's hands paused for just a moment, then continued. "What did you tell him?" "The name," Malcolm said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Was he happy?" "I think so," Malcolm said. "As much as he knows how to be." She nodded, kept moving. "Evelina," he said. Thank you. For not submitting the package. For giving the 72 hours. For..." He paused. "For the promise you made me. About our son." She turned and looked at him. Directly the way she always did now, without the softening lens of what she had once hoped he would be. "Don't thank me," she said. "Do the work. That's what the thank you looks like." "Yes," he said. "I know." She turned back. He stayed at the table. And the kitchen was quiet, and the fountain ran outside, and somewhere upstairs a room had been prepared for a boy who was not yet born, but was already in every way that mattered, the reason everything had changed. 6 days later, at 11:47 in the morning, on a Thursday in December, Evelina Renford Vexley went into labor. Malcolm was in a meeting with the Oversight Committee when his phone vibrated on the table in front of him. He looked at the screen. One word from Evelina's number. "Now." He stood up without explanation, picked up his jacket and walked out of the room. The committee members looked at each other. Someone said something. Malcolm did not hear it. He drove to the hospital in 22 minutes. He was in the waiting room for 4 hours, which was its own specific kind of reckoning. 4 hours of sitting with nothing to manage, nothing to negotiate, nothing to perform. Just the waiting, just the clock. Just the understanding that on the other side of a door he could not open. Something was happening that was entirely beyond his control and entirely more important than anything he had ever controlled. At 3:59 in the afternoon, a nurse came through the door and looked at him. "Mr. Vexley." He stood up. "She's asking for you," the nurse said. He followed her through the door. Evelina was sitting up when he came in, and she was holding a bundle of white hospital blanket, and she was looking down at it with an expression Malcolm had never seen on her face before, not in 14 years, not in any room, not in any version of the life they had built and broken, and were now piece by piece rebuilding into something different. She was looking at their son with absolute uncomplicated love, the kind that asks nothing back, the kind that exists entirely on its own terms. Malcolm crossed the room and stood beside her. She looked up at him, and then she held the bundle out. He took his son in his arms for the first time. The boy was small and red-faced, and furiously, magnificently alive, and he fit against Malcolm's chest with a precision that felt like something being placed in the exact location it had always been meant to occupy. Malcolm looked down at him and felt something move through him, not like anything he had words for, not like anything that had ever happened in a boardroom or a negotiation or a hotel suite or a car with roses on the passenger seat. Something clean, something that had no history in it and no management and no performance, just this, just now, just the weight of a new life in arms that were going to have to become worthy of holding it. "Hey," Malcolm said quietly to his son. His voice came out different than he expected, softer, more honest. "Hey, I'm going to do better, I promise." The boy opened his eyes. They were dark, unfocused, taking in a world they had no framework for, yet a world that would be shaped inevitably and profoundly by what the people holding him chose to do with the time they had. Malcolm looked up at Evelina. She was watching him, not with love, not with forgiveness, not with the soft reconciliation that lesser stories would have offered. She was watching him with clear eyes and an open question, the same question she had been asking in different ways for 14 months. "Are you real this time?" He did not answer with words. He held his son, and he stayed in the room, and he did not reach for his phone, and he did not manage the moment. He just stayed. And Evelina Renford Vexley, who had built a 14-month case from silence and patience and the specific fury of a woman who refused to disappear, quietly looked at the father of her child holding their son for the first time and allowed herself carefully to believe that what she was seeing was the beginning of something true. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. The papers were signed in a conference room, not a courtroom, because there was nothing left to fight about. Every term had been met, every disclosure filed. The Oversight Committee published its first quarterly report. The company was restructuring. The name Vexley still existed, but it meant something different now. Something earned, not inherited. Something that would have to be proved forward day by day, choice by choice. In the full light of a transparency that had no room left for management, Malcolm Vexley lost everything in one envelope. And then in the slow and unglamorous way that real things are built, he started again, not with roses on the passenger seat, not with a rehearsed apology and a borrowed smile, with the truth in both hands and a son who deserved a father made of something better than the man he used to be, and the understanding, finally completely without escape, that the only foundation worth building on is the one that doesn't need to be hidden. That was the story. That was how it ended, not with an empire. With a boy and a choice and a man who arrived at both too late and just in time.